involved in both of those scenarios. And there is a deep cognitive dissonance in Washington that, Biden pretends to be woke all of a sudden now. But yeah, this includes that too. I mean, you've got to have an international perspective on this. It's like a disgusting statement by Biden, who seemed like he didn't even want to be there.
I have no doubt he didn't want to be there. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Jamie Skillen. He is an associate professor of environmental studies and director of the Calvin Ecosystem Preserve and Native Gardens at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His book, This Land is My Land, Rebellion in the West. We will talk about that in a moment. We'll be right back. In the meantime, today's sponsor is BetterHelp Online Counseling. They're giving our audience 10% off their first month when you go to betterhelp.com/Majority Report. BetterHelp gives you access to your own fully licensed and accredited therapist via phone, chat, or video. A lot of therapists, as you know, right now in particular, have long wait lists. It can take weeks, months sometimes before they can see you. But when you sign up with BetterHelp, they match you with a therapist based on your specific needs. You'll be communicating with them in less than 24 hours. Look, particularly during COVID, but frankly, at all times, very helpful to have someone to talk to work out specific issues, general issues. Therapy has always played a big role in my life at different times, more or less. But difficult, particularly right now. The stress is off the charts. Even people coming back, I think there's a little post-traumatic, frankly, quality to sort of coming out of a pandemic and sort of this netherworld. Very good time to see a therapist. And the beauty of BetterHelp is that A, there are no long lines. B, once BetterHelp connects you with a therapist, if it is not a good fit, it's not working out for whatever reason, you can switch to a new one. You can do so at any time for no additional charge. They have thousands of licensed therapists. They're from all over the country. Sometimes maybe you're looking for a therapist who deals with a specific issue that you're having, a specialty. You can find them through BetterHelp. BetterHelp also tends to be more affordable than therapists you'd find through traditional means. You don't have to have insurance to use BetterHelp, and they have financial aid options for those who qualify. BetterHelp is giving everyone in our audience 10% off your first month when you go to betterhelp.com/Majority Report. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Majority Report. You can find the URL in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube. It will be in our podcast description if you're listening to the program. Do we have Jamie? We do. Okay. I want to welcome to the program Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Calvin Ecosystem Preserve and Native Gardens at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, author of This Land is My Land, Rebellion in the West, Jamie Skillen. Jamie, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'm here with Emma Vigland. Really appreciate you coming to talk to us about it. So essentially what your book covers is really on some level the past 50 years of rebellions around the federal land use and control, and how over this period of time the rebellions have become almost sort of less narrowly tailored and less sort of materially based. Or maybe I shouldn't say less, but they've expanded to be more almost ideological and sort of tied into sort of other ideas, conservative things that are happening around the country. I did not realize that when you're looking from the Rockies west, 45% of that land is owned by our government. In Alaska, it's over 60%. That is pretty stunning. But let's start with the sagebrush rebellions. I wasn't familiar with those, actually, and we should say that this is going to lead us up in some ways to January 6th in an odd way. But let's start with the Sagebrush rebellions. What were they, and why?
Right. It's a good question. And I want to emphasize, it is such a different reality in the American West, where the federal government is the dominant land use planner. So in the state of Nevada is 83% federally owned. So when the federal government sneezes in that region, people feel it. And the Sagebrush Rebellion, which sort of launched in 1979, is a reaction to a series of laws that Congress passed mainly in the 1970s. And those laws reshaped federal land management, particularly throughout the West. And for a lot of Westerners, particularly those who used what had been the public domain lands, and they'd use those lands with limited regulation, limited oversight, Congress's new laws sort of said, wait, we're going to have professional land managers make more of the decisions. And so particularly ranchers began to feel a real shift, that the ranches that had felt like their own were now being run by people with ecology degrees. And there was a frustration of the growing regulation and I think the reduced resource development. So I mentioned ranching, but also frustration with new developments in logging, in mining, and in other areas. And so the Sagebrush Rebellion is essentially when Western states, led by Nevada, began to pass legislation saying, incorrectly, that federal land rightfully belonged to the states and not to the federal government. And as you said, that rebellion was it was a regional conflict. It was waged by Westerners who had a material interest in those lands and resources. And I should add, it was a bipartisan rebellion. There were Democrats and Republicans in those state legislatures who were fighting federal control.
Well, so, just speak to how aligned the interests were between ranchers, right, who are ostensibly, maybe characterize ranchers for us, because, when I think of a rancher, I think like, oh, it's I don't know, it's a family and they have their small plot of land, or maybe it's a little bigger plot of land, and they raise some cattle and maybe some other livestock, and it's sort of like the evolution of the Ponderosa, I guess. And then when I think of loggers and miners, I start to think of bigger corporations and almost like multinationals. Like where do they meet? How hard was that to sort of, I guess, cement that relationship so that they could provide some type of political pressure on particularly in Nevada in the legislature?
In 1979, the Sagebrush Rebellion really wasn't focused on federal lands as a whole. So they weren't really arguing about national parks, for example. The focus was on what would be called public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And those lands don't have a lot of timber value outside of Oregon. So the main issues were mining and grazing. And for a rancher in the West, it is very, very difficult to have a ranch operating entirely on private land. It's almost impossible. In the West, there are areas where you might need 100 acres per cow in order to feed them for a year. And so a rancher who might own, 500 acres privately held or deeded land might need 750,000 acres in order to make a good living. And so the ranchers in the West have historically been dependent on access to these vast federal acres just to survive. I mean, ranching in the Intermountain West, where there's very low rainfall, it's a tough way to make a living.
I mean, how, and this will come up when we start talking about the Bundys and whatnot, but how
Sure.
sort of like, how conscious was it that they're getting a government subsidy, right? I mean, I own some land, if it was private land, their neighbors probably wouldn't say like, yeah, sure, Just have them come graze,
Right.
whenever works for you guys. We're
Right.
okay with that. I mean, if it was private land, they'd say like, yeah, you can graze, but here's how much it's going to cost. And if you don't like it, start a different business or something. How conscious were these, are these ranchers of that dynamic, or how do they see it?
So, generalizing, what I would say is certainly in the late 70s, but even today, public lands ranchers don't see their access to the land as a subsidy. And part of it is we all understand ourselves through stories, through our history. And if you go back to when people settled the Intermountain West and began running livestock on those public lands, those lands were known as just the public domain, and there was no regulation, there was no management, there was no oversight, and that was legal. So what a lot of ranchers would say is they're the ones who were actually managing the land on behalf of the country. They were the ones putting in improvements like fences and wells and water. And to give an example of this, around 1930, 1931, President Hoover offered to give all of that public domain land to the Western states, and they said no, that they didn't want it. So for a lot of ranchers, it was this experience of, listen, we're the only ones who care about this land. We're putting our blood and sweat into it. So there was a real sense that there was an ownership of that land. And when the federal government began to regulate it, beginning in the 30s, ranchers were okay with a very, very modest fee. But they saw that fee as really just paying for the services of management. And when the federal government began saying, no, we're going to tell you how many cows you can graze, or we're going to tell you when the grazing season is, then ranchers felt like the federal government was really restricting their private property. And I think that sense continues today.
Tell us about the, I guess this is where the Bundy family comes in through these sagebrush rebellions. So when their history goes back to the early 1900s, I guess, and their family, this land, presumably, right? I mean, for there to maintain their ownership, I guess it's pass it down from my dad, from his dad, et cetera, et cetera. And I do mean dad, right? At least in the case of the Bundys. So what, just give us a little background as to their relationship to these rebellions.
Yeah, when Cliven Bundy, who is sort of the current patriarch of the Bundy family, when Cliven Bundy began ranching, he was working with his family ranch. And when he took over in the 1970s, this is just when federal regulation began to impinge on his sense of ownership and freedom. And so his ranch, like many in the West, he has private land, deeded land. He depended on tens of thousands of acres of federal land. And actually what he began to experience was just new regulations, higher costs that he was having to pay the federal government. And here, if viewers want to get into some of the weeds, that one of the really complicating issues that I'm empathetic with is there's an interesting relationship in the West between land and water that's hard to appreciate if you live in the East. And to say it very quickly, the Bundy family owns or has rights to surface water, and those rights are given by the state of Nevada. They can only exercise those rights if they have cattle grazing on federal land, drinking that water. And so when the federal government began to tell the Bundy family, hey, you can't have as many cows, not only was that hurting them economically, but they began to worry that they might lose their water rights as well.
Can you expand on just that period in the 1970s when from the federal government, there were things like the Endangered Species Act coming down, and just how the confluence of those things informed, this exact dynamic, and then of course came to the head with the Bundy incident of a few years back.
Yeah, the federal government really wasn't involved in environmental regulation until the late 1960s in a meaningful way. And I'll just highlight three laws There was something called the National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, the Endangered Species Act of 19